Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and I'm sure some more will also join a bit later on. We're excited for another deep dive today with Srinath, Dr. Srinath, with us, who will talk from Quantron about BEV or FCEV, fuel cell electric trucks. And I think that's also based on your white paper you published, and also fantastic to have you actually as one of our earliest ambassadors, thinking back many years now. So,
That's
Srinath,
true.
with this, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Simon. It's a pleasure to be here and to continue working with Battery Associates in some capacity. You already mentioned it. I was one of the early ambassadors to join you on this journey a few years back already now. We also had the pleasure of doing a presentation the first battery day on the solid state batteries, on which we did a white paper back then. But this time I'm here to present a little more on battery and fuel cell electric trucks, which use cases and which conditions and which systematic challenges make which technology more suitable from the point of view of the customers at the end of the day. And I'm talking on that because I'm working at a company called Quantron as the corporate and product strategy senior manager. It's a small startup based out of Augsburg in the hinterland of Munich, which is doing battery and fuel cell electric vehicles, especially commercial vehicles mainly, buses, trucks, vans, for example, but also a company which is trying to evolve from being a production company of vehicles into a company which does a platform bundled offer solution for these customers. Apart from Battery Associates and Quantron, I'm also doing a couple of volunteering roles at Inter-German Young Leaders Forum, the Federation of Indian Industry. In the past, I was heading the Battery Competence Center of Oliver Wyman, and also a project manager there as a consultant. That's when I met Simon and the Battery Associates team. Before that, of course, I was continuing in the truck world with a role at Daimler as a strategy analyst. And that's a bit to my person. So I mentioned already about Quantron as a company. So our focus is to be the solution platform for commercial vehicles, for zero emission commercial vehicles mainly. And for this, we want to use the best possible technologies, the best possible solutions, and bring it together for the customers based on what their specific use cases are and what they exactly need for those use cases. When you're talking about this transition, however, what is important to remember is that from where we are today, where you have highly polluting diesel vehicles, especially, but also petrol vehicles, the commercial vehicle space, it's mainly the diesels. From that, you're trying to shift to a battery and fuel cell electric world. The batteries are a bit more advanced, but I'll come back to that in a bit. At the same time, you also have to remember that you're moving from fossil fuels to building up the complete green electricity and hydrogen supply chains. Again, a bit more advanced in terms of maturity or in terms of progress on the green electricity side compared to hydrogen. And you're also looking at changing the entire network of fueling stations and pumps from today, the ubiquitous fueling stations, forecourts, etc., that business model, to move it to charging stations and hydrogen refueling stations. And why is this important? Because it's a challenge which is simply too big for any one company, no matter how big the company is as a vehicle manufacturer or as an oil and gas company. It's too big for any one company or one company from one sector to master alone. It's a huge system level change that's necessary. And we believe that ecosystem approaches are the way to go to address those changes. But that brings me to the question, what are we talking about? Is it the battery electric or the fuel cell electric vehicles which will supposedly win this race that they are in? And these are, of course, the leading technologies that we are talking about in terms of zero emission. There are, of course, other options there which have been explored, be it hydrogen, ICE trucks, be it biofuels, synfuels, on-road charging. And there's been different views on which technology is better. There's been, dogmatic opinions, even to some extent, with people calling one or the other technology really foolish. People looking at various factors and saying this is better or that is better. But we need to take a look at the bigger picture to be able to understand, again, from a system level, based on use cases, what really makes sense. And that's what I would like to give to you guys as the key message at the end of this. But where do these discussions always start? They almost always start and sometimes also end with the question of energy efficiency. And when we are talking about that, when the industry experts are talking about that, it's always about the powertrain efficiency. And that's sort of a no-brainer. If you think about it, battery electric vehicles are, no matter if you're talking about passenger cars or electric trucks or buses, the battery electric solution is the much more efficient one. Well to tank, you're talking about 85 to 90% efficiency in the battery electric case, tank to wheel about, again, 70% overall, simply because there's lesser conversions that you're doing along the way. And if you're talking about it from the fuel cell perspective, then you lose already 20% in electrolysis process. You lose again about 25% in compressing and transporting the hydrogen. And at the fuel cell, you again lose about 60%. And you end up with about 40% efficiency. So, from that point of view, if you think about it from a well to tank and tank to wheel perspective, it's actually kind of a no-brainer to say that battery electric trucks are the way to go. And I'm guessing some of you are really happy to hear that, but it's a lot more complicated, especially when you're talking about commercial vehicles. And why is that the case? Like I said, you need to look at it from a system perspective, and the powertrain part is only one cog in that entire system. There is the part about the energy, so how you're producing and transporting or transmitting the energy to the point of use or the point of consumption, and how you're dispensing it, right? And let's probably take each of these and unpack them a little bit. Maybe we start with the powertrain because that's the no-brainer. If you think about the technology readiness and digitalization readiness, I mentioned this a bit in the beginning as well. Battery electric vehicles are generally a bit further down the road. So what you see today is already the second generation of battery electric vehicles from the bigger vehicle manufacturers. In terms of passenger cars, it's even the third generation that you see now. So that's even further ahead. But the fuel cell case, you're just beginning to see the first fuel cells based trucks coming to the market. And there is, of course, this sort of, if you think about it in terms of a hype cycle, there's also the sort of a dip that the fuel cell vehicles or technologies are seeing, because all the hype that was there a couple of years back probably has started tempering down. So we know about how things are going at some companies like Nikola, or when Hyundai is pulling out of the Swiss market because hydrogen prices are too high, etc. And that, of course, means that there's a teething issue. There's a trough of disillusionment that these vehicles and this technology is going through. But if you think about it in terms of long-term reduction potential of costs, simply because of the way these vehicles are made, the material costs that are necessary for making batteries, for example, versus the costs which are necessary for scaling up the production of fuel cells or tanks for hydrogen, the potential for fuel cell is probably a little bit higher from today's point of view in terms of what we might be able to achieve in terms of cost down. There is just physical and chemical limits that we'll at some point hit with batteries, which are going to be harder to negotiate, and then the next extra X% of reduction in cost will be that much harder. If we move on, again, now talking about the component part, there was a nice study a couple of years back from the European Commission Joint Research Center, which looked at the different raw materials. We extended it a little bit with discussions in Europe as well as in the US with some supply chain participants. And there it looks a little more tricky. I mean, the picture will look very different if you're talking about a country like China, which has invested heavily in the upstream and midstream of the battery raw materials as well as the fuel cell raw materials. But if you look at it in terms of supply chain risks, simply put, there is lesser risk in terms of the materials necessary for fuel cells today when compared to batteries, especially for manufacturers based out of Europe or US. And that brings me to the third point. This is an analysis that we did internally based on our own vehicles, but also benchmarking a few of the other vehicles. We basically decided to see what the difference would be in the weight of the powertrain, the more range you try to pack into the vehicle. So it's very simple. The more range you need to get out of a heavy-duty truck, for example, the bigger batteries, the heavier batteries you need. And for a range of about for the case that we considered here, for a range of about 700 kilometers, for example, we already needed about 7 tons of batteries. In comparison, the fuel cell system was, of course, much lighter, coming down to about 2.5, 3 tons, including batteries, tanks, fuel cell, etc., including the other aggregates as well. So there, the question becomes a bit tricky, because if you are driving in use cases where the amount of driving you need to do is not too much, the amount of mileage that you have to cover daily is not too much, then it's easier to say that probably batteries are the better way to go, or even the lighter powertrain solution. but the more auxiliary power needs you have. Imagine you have a refrigerated cargo that you're carrying on the truck. This would need probably 20 kilowatt hour of energy for just cooling the cargo every hour, and that massively affects what range you'll be able to get out of the battery for driving the vehicle. So at the same time, if you think about driving a fully loaded 40-foot truck uphill in cold temperature against headwind. I mean, those of you who are driving electric cars, Teslas, or the other passenger vehicles with batteries would already know what I mean. Those kind of extreme cases for a truck, if you apply the same kind of logic, you lose about 50% of the range. So if you have a battery electric truck where the manufacturer says with this truck you can drive 500 kilometers on a single charge, we try to drive on these conditions, then you're ending up with effectively 150 kilometers or something of range, which is not too much. And why is that important? Because then you need to recharge. And then it's a question of how much time do you need for recharging the truck or refueling the truck, and how easy it is for a driver to shift from today's perspective of recharging or refueling a diesel truck into a future battery or a hydrogen truck. And from that convenience and time perspective, if you look at battery electric trucks, even with CCS technology today, for 500 kilowatt hour of usable energy, you end up with about 2 hours of charging time. In the future with MCS, that'll probably halve. So the dream, the wish of many companies is that you drive for 4 hours, then you have 45 minutes to recharge your truck, and then you're able to drive again for 4 hours. That's the vision. But in the fuel cell trucks case today, it's already less than 20 minutes even for the heavy truck that we produce in our company for a full range of 700 kilometers. And in the future, when dispensing technologies improve, we even expect it to become half again to about 10 minutes of refueling from zero to full tank. I mean, this is not linear, neither in the case of batteries nor in the case of trucks with hydrogen tanks. But just to give you a feeling for how this looks like. At the same time, you have to also think about it from a system perspective. I said this before. So how much space do you need, and how much money do you need for setting up a huge charging park, or in terms of a hydrogen refueling station? That's also important because if you think about the amount of chargers that are necessary just in Europe, that was an estimate from the European Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Charging Master Plan. They estimated that for covering the use cases of battery electric trucks in Europe, we would need about 235,000 overnight chargers at the depots, for example, as well as 36,000 chargers with CCS plus MCS in the mix at public highway overnight charging points. On top of that, again, super fast chargers for along the highways. And this would, of course, mean that you have a lot of money which needs to be invested in scaling up MCS charger production, cabling, grids, et cetera, for setting up that infrastructure. And that's tough because today it's almost nearing the end of 2023, but we still only have MCS in the prototype stage. Only next year we're going to start seeing the first series production of MCS. And after that, within 6 years, to build up that kind of a network is going to be a huge challenge. And I'm talking about Europe, but you can apply the same logic to the US, for example. In China, it's again a bit different because battery swapping technology has taken a surprising lead there. We didn't look at that in too much detail because we focus more on Europe and US as a company. But that's what you're looking at. And if you talk about hydrogen trucks, as a counterpoint to that, based on the current European regulations, if you need about one hydrogen refueling station every 150 kilometers of highway or something as a target, then effectively you need only about between 700 to 1,000 stations by 2030 to be set up. I say only, I mean that's still a very big challenge, but it looks a little bit more manageable from that point of view. And why is that important? Because with that you also have costs. So if you're looking about the amount of cost needed for deploying this and the utilization rate, simply because a truck needs much higher time to charge than it needs for refueling. If you have a use case where there's a low number of trucks, then the amount of investment that you have to do for a battery charging park is actually low when you amortize it over the number of trucks. But the more number of trucks you have, the more difficult it becomes to set up a big charging park, because all these trucks are charging in parallel. And the unit cost of infrastructure then start rising exponentially. But in the fuel cell case, it's exactly the other way around almost, because the same refueling station, which costs about some million, would then be refueling many more trucks. So the offtake of hydrogen from those stations would be much higher. And with a higher number of trucks, then these costs start getting divided much more, smoothly across the number of vehicles. And that brings me to the other point, the third point, basically, which is energy. And if you look at the amount of energy available, there's simply more cleaner. There's a bit of an edge to hydrogen from that perspective. If you think about, there was a nice analysis by Hydrogen Council in McKinsey a couple of years back. They basically said, if you take the same solar panel setup and put it in Germany, which is not a sun-rich region, you'd probably, including all the losses, end up at about 680 kilowatt hour from 950 kilowatt hour that you generate in a year. But the same solar panel, when used in, or the setup, if used in the Middle East, would generate 2,200 kilowatt hour of energy. And then even after you discount the losses in electrolysis and shipment and tank to wheel losses in running, the usable energy at the wheel is effectively the same. So that was a very interesting analysis, because it says that despite transmission or transportation losses, you effectively end up with the same kind of energy efficiency from energy perspective. And that's interesting because it's easier to transport energy. But I come back to that. Before that, maybe just one more point on the carbon intensity and energy costs from that perspective. So if you take the EU grid, for example, it's quite carbon intensive. And now if you convert that carbon intensive electricity through electrolysis into hydrogen, that's actually very bad, because the carbon footprint is much higher. But if you're comparing the electricity generated from the Middle East, for example, converting that to hydrogen and then transporting that, and comparing that hydrogen imported from a green country, green sun-rich or wind-rich energy producing country, and using that and benchmarking that against, the domestic green electricity production in Europe or US, the hydrogen actually gets its nose in front a little tiny bit. And then I come to the point of transportation. So, in terms of transmission losses, I hinted at this earlier. So if you're talking about electricity, not only do we have to invest a lot in grid infrastructure upgrades, I think there's multiple billion kilometers of cables which need to be laid and copper that's necessary for that, for example. But even after doing that, we would still have huge transmission losses, because where green electricity is produced is offshore wind farms, for example, and that has to be brought to the point of consumption, which is could be anywhere along the transportation corridors. And with high voltage AC grid, you're losing about 6 to 10% of electricity every 1,000 kilometers, and about 4% in high voltage DC grids. In comparison, even though you're spending more energy for liquefying or compressing the hydrogen, it's simply easier to transport molecules than it is to transport electrons over much longer distances. So if you have tankers or trains or cargo, again, trucks or even pipelines, these are all various transport routes which are being explored for building up the European hydrogen backbone, for example. And that could make the availability of hydrogen and the cost of hydrogen with scale also a little bit more easier. And that means that if the point of consumption is far away from the point of production of energy, then the balance again tips a little bit in favor of hydrogen vehicles. What does all of this mean if you take it together? Let's take the concrete example of trucks. If you have a high trip distance, if you have a cargo which is constrained by weight, or if you have cargo which is which is sensitive to time, so you want to move the thing fast from A to B, and you don't want to have a lot of downtime along the way, especially for charging. Those are all cases where fuel cell trucks seem to make a bit more sense, and even from a cost perspective and a system efficiency point of view. And the other way around, there are use cases, for example, if your cargo is not very heavy, if you have time to move it, if it's not a critical consumer good, for example, it doesn't need to be cooled or something, then it might even make sense to move the cargo with a battery electric truck, because again, the efficiency speaks for the battery electric truck. That's now looking at it qualitatively. We did the same exercise a bit more quantitatively with some of our customers and test fleets. So last mile distribution was one example that we took. And we looked at all these factors. We did, weighting of these factors with them, and did a very simple balance scorecard to see which makes more sense. And not so surprisingly, for the last mile use cases within the cities, for example, we end up with the battery electric trucks having a clear and distinct advantage. So you see on the right the truck that we have in our portfolio for doing those use cases. If you talk about regional distribution, for example, with a little bit higher tonnage, but a bit more mileage, then we ended up with a case. In this particular case, the battery truck still had its advantage compared to the fuel cell, but it was just marginal. If you add refrigeration cargo to that, or uphill topography, or longer or rural distances, for example, then it goes the other way. And for long haul, it was very clearly in favor of the fuel cell truck. To where the edge was. So that brings me to my last slide with my key takeaways that I would like to share from this presentation. It's very important to look at it from a system level to identify which use cases and which applications are needed, and that determines in the end of the day whether a battery or a fuel cell truck makes more sense. But if you're talking about it from an overall perspective, at the end of the day, we're going to need both. So it's not an either or solution. It's going to be an and solution that we will need in the future for decarbonizing transport quickly. If you're not willing to wait for 30 years or something for the best in class solid state batteries to come and revolutionize and make everything battery electric, if you're looking for solutions today and in the next 5 years, then we're going to need both to be done. And like I said in the very beginning, we're going to have to do, look at it from an ecosystem point of view, because all these technology, infrastructure, and cost challenges simply cannot be done by one company or one player alone. And with that, I bring myself to the end of my presentation. I would love to have any questions that you guys have for this.
Thank you so much, Srinath. Yeah, definitely good to have these thoughts on a battery day, because of course, the one thing I'm still very happy for, each of your, vehicles, also fuel cells, also needs a battery as well. So
exactly.
So there's no real issue there. There's two questions already. I will go with them, and then I also have one question myself. But
sure.
Roger's question is, why are there so many relentlessly negative voices on the merit of fuel cell like EVs, given the merits of the proposition?
So we have to be honest here. There is a lot of criticism of fuel cells, and a lot of that criticism is also fair, and we have to admit that. So the first thing is, like I said in the very beginning, the energy efficiency perspective, especially from the powertrain point of view, is clearly one which goes more in the direction of battery electric vehicles, right? And this is why it's not an either or solution. It's, the battery electric vehicles do have their advantage. At the same time, there is one particular gentleman, for example, who built up a very successful battery electric passenger vehicle company, who has very clear views on fuel cells, and he's also an opinion leader and influencer on these technologies, and he has very clear views. And the people who follow the church of this particular person will, of course, buy into the arguments that he's been making against one of these technologies. And that also plays a part. We are at the end of the day in a social media-driven world where narratives and almost dogmatic views take a lot of preference over detailed, systematic, comprehensive analysis, talking to customers to really understand their pain points and so on. That's also why I don't worry too much about these negative voices, because the question for me is, whose negative voices are these? When we as a company are talking to customers today at the IAA in Hanover, for example, in Europe, or at the ACT Expo in the US, what we have been observing is that there are always customers coming and saying, hey, we tried the first and second generation of the battery electric vehicles in the last couple of years, and now we are beginning to understand what works and what doesn't work. And we are now, intrigued by the promise that the other technology, in this case fuel cells, seems to have. We have one blue chip anchor customer as a company, and I don't want to take names, but this anchor customer was already using a lot of our light battery electric vehicles in a European city for last mile delivery in the last 2 years. And then they wanted to test our fuel cell variant. And within 2 months, they did more than 20,000 kilometers with a fuel cell truck. There will be a press announcement on this in a couple of weeks coming up from my company. But the fleet trial with this fuel cell truck in that use case simply showed that they could go for longer distances, that they needed lesser downtime when the truck was standing around getting recharged. They could deliver in a lot of the suburban areas which the battery electric truck couldn't reach on a daily basis for the e-commerce deliveries that they were doing. And that's just proof, that there are use cases where this same company realized that they need both solutions in their portfolio. So I think the awareness will come gradually. Of course, negative news doesn't help. So every time a company like Nikola, who's seen as the leader or who has positioned itself as a leader in the space, does something wrong or makes a mistake, it's gonna give wind in the sails of the naysayers. Hydrogen prices jumping up, for example, will not help. But if we take a step back from these short-term effects and see the big picture over a much longer time perspective, again looking at it from a system-level view, then I believe that these negative voices will slowly go away as the awareness and knowledge of this increases. I know it's a long answer, but I hope that answers that, Roger.
Thanks so much. I think what extensive answer, and also as you said, right, I think goes both ways, right? Also with as you said, like there's some bad actors as well in the US as well, right? And then kind of mess it up for everyone in some way, right? And it's the same risk in batteries as well, right? Where some actors not working properly, and then they kind of have like a negative.
That's true. We had this example with Better Place, I think, in the past with swapping, if I remember. So
yeah, so exactly. So it's always, and sometimes people are too early, but sometimes also more challenging. Haiksha has the question: is it possible to use FC for eVTOL? Not sure if there's anything I ever looked at.
Me personally, no, but I know that there is a very good hydrogen-based aviation company which just had a very good funding round recently. So I would assume the answer is yes. Also because it's probably more difficult to transport heavy batteries on flights. But that's me talking as an outsider with zero knowledge of the aviation industry.
That's interesting. And of course, there's different approaches there as well. And I think also one thing is interesting. I think things go in circles, right? Where I think people start with one technology, then they're like, okay, this is limited for what I need right now. Go to the next one. Then maybe the other one advanced again, you go back. And I feel like also there's definitely, especially till things are super widely adopted, people also keep trying, and always move around.
And these are all technologies which are developing every day at a breakneck speed. So, if you think about batteries today, they are nothing like the batteries which are there in the first generation of passenger vehicles with battery electric drives like 6-7 years back. The amount of range you can pull out of it, the amount of charging speeds you have, it's a completely different game. And in 5 years, I'm sure this will again look very different.
And maybe a question for mind also on that regards, because I've been thinking about it, why you show that, and actually for fun, we had a project recently in hydrogen, so we also have been helping a client on the hydrogen supply chain. So we had the pleasure to look at this a bit more in depth, and also all the challenges, but also opportunities. For example, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, right? Just massive opportunity to reduce the cost and go more, have green hydrogen closer to the parity of gray hydrogen. I guess my question would be, we have seen it now with batteries, right? Where automotives also kind of realize they might have to go into the battery game, or at least some of them think so, or maybe get some mines, or even start, building their own like power cores, Volkswagen, etc. So I'm just wondering, I know you're also somewhat of a, I don't know, does it count as a startup? I don't know, you have to tell me, but still an emerging company, I guess, in some regards. Do you think it makes sense then also for, to go vertical and say, okay, eventually we have to become hydrogen producers ourselves?
I would not venture into making hydrogen as a company. It's too far away from our core competences. I know that this is the approach that a few of the OEMs followed. A few of the OEMs even burned their hands trying to follow that approach, trying to vertically integrate. competences that they didn't have in-house, trying to build it up. I mean, think about the software. I mean, the kind of challenges that some of the German OEMs have in building up their software divisions over the last 5 years is very well documented. It's simply because it's not just hiring the people who can do that. It's also about having the competence. It's about having the mindset, having an understanding of that supply chain, of the value chain totally. And that's a business which there are other companies who can do it much better. I mean, we as a company, even the vehicles, I mean, we want to be a platform player in the future. We do the vehicles today because, especially on the fuel cell side, there are not enough vehicles on the market. But on the other hand, when we talk to customers, there's a huge appetite and interest because they realize where the limits of the battery electric vehicles are today, right? And that's one of the main reasons why we do vehicles. But in the future, if we are looking at vehicles as commodities, then we don't need to do them anymore. But what we would like to do is then do the platform. So be the Airbnb or the Salesforce or or the Amazon of transportation as a platform company. And why I'm saying that is also the reason why the amount of investment that's needed for building up a vehicle plant. And this is also the mistake that many startups did. They did SPACs and gained a lot of money, and then they decided that they reinvent every part of the cabin and the chassis and the powertrain themselves, and they ran out of money and trying to make a prototype and then to industrialize it. And that's just looking at the automotive business. Now, if you extend that and say, okay, we don't do just the automotive, but we also then do the entire capex intensive all the investments necessary in producing the hydrogen, in transporting the hydrogen, etc. That's a nightmare for a company which has no background there to do it. Even the big automotive OEMs, if you look at it, they do joint ventures on fuel cells, for example, but they are very happy to say the oil and gas companies, the Shells and the BPs and the Totals of the world are better positioned to take care of scaling up the hydrogen supply and production. And we will work with them in partnerships at an arm's length distance maybe, but not invest directly in hydrogen valleys or in hydrogen production facilities, etc.
Cool, thanks. And of course, here also important that I guess regulation has a bigger lever here as well, looking at Europe, right, to decarbonize the hydrogen supply chain, maybe than you as a company have, but maybe at some point, hopefully, we should get all big and then, you have also more power there as well to maybe dictate some of the requirements a bit more.
That's true.
Brilliant. I think if there's no additional questions, we can maybe wrap it up because we're also about to go back to the final closing in the main stage again. But yeah, I just want to do a massive thanks, Rinat, for sharing these great insights, and always great to have you.
Yeah, let's catch up soon. Take care.
Sounds good. Thanks everyone. See you soon. Bye-bye.